What's up, everybody? Welcome to episode 13 of That Triathlon Show. Today's show is a really exciting one. It's about the psychobiology of endurance performance. As always, I'm your host, Michael, and I'm joined here today by Professor Samuele Marcora, who is the Director of Research at the School of Sports and Exercise Sciences at the University of Kent. And Professor Marcora is a leading expert on the psychobiology in endurance performance. And he, together with his team of researchers, had done extensive research showing that endurance performance is limited by our minds just as much as by our muscles, to an extent by our minds and to an extent by our muscles. I shouldn't go into how much he'll go into that himself later. But he's also working hard on a fascinating topic related to how our endurance performance is limited by the psychology, and that is brain endurance training, or BET. So we'll go into that topic as well. So without further ado, warm welcome to the show, Samuele.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
No, it's my pleasure. And anything that you want to fill in, any gaps in that intro before we get started with the main topics for today?
Well, I guess your listener will find out very soon, but I'm actually originally from Italy, although I did my PhD, and obviously I'm working in the UK. But I did my first degree in physical education in Milan, in Italy, and then I went to the States to do my master, and then moved to the UK. So I've been all over the places.
Okay, that's an interesting background, definitely. And now you're at the University of Kent, and you actually recently moved to Wales, I heard. So,
yeah, temporarily, yes.
Temporarily, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive into the main topic, which is the psychobiology of endurance performance. So first, can you explain to us what it is, and also why are the traditional physiological models not enough to explain our limits in endurance performance?
Yes, there are two main physiological models, if you like, depending on the intensity of and the duration of the endurance performance. The one that try to explain kind of high intensity, relatively short duration endurance performance, obviously has to do with the maximum oxygen consumption. I'm sure your listeners and yourself are very familiar with this concept. So, which is basically limited primarily by the amount of oxygen that your cardiovascular system can pump to the muscle, and the ability of the muscle to utilize the oxygen without producing too much lactic acid, because that will cause muscle fatigue, etc., etc. I'm sure your readers and listeners are familiar with this. However, it becomes longer duration, obviously glycogen deprivation, and the running out of basically of this energy source within the muscle is also being proposed as one of the main causes of fatigue. So, but regardless of the precise mechanism, there's actually the energy depletion model of the cardiovascular kind of muscle fatigue model. They all have as an assumption that their capacity to maintain a given pace for a prolonged period of time, which is actually what I'm primarily investigating, which is the very basics of any endurance performance, is limited by your muscle fatigue. So your muscle, your locomotor muscle, to sustain your pace regardless of how much effort you put into the task. So it's like some sort of a physiological failure, if you like. I actually tested this assumption in a very simple study because I couldn't actually find any published research actually testing this assumption that's been around for decades. And when I did, I demonstrated that immediately after exhaustion doing an endurance task, the muscle were capable, the muscle, not just the muscle, but the central nervous system in connection with the muscle. So the whole body was able to produce way more power than the power required by the endurance exercise, suggesting that the causes of what we call exhaustion, the reason for the person being unable to sustain that pace, was not the failure of the neuromuscular system to produce the power, but something else. And my suggestion is that is actually our perception of effort and in combination with our motivation that limits the ability to sustain a given pace for a prolonged period of time. In other words, you stop because you feel that you are unable to continue to maintain that pace. Not because, or you slow down when you do a race. Not because you are really unable to, but because you feel you are unable to. So that's in a very short summary of the model.
Yes, and that is absolutely fascinating and really interesting that nobody had done that study before, because as you said, it's a pretty simple setup really, and easy to test that hypothesis. Before we continue, we're doing this interview on Google Hangouts, but we have a bit of a bad connection, so let's turn our cameras off and see if we can get some better sound quality for the listeners. So turning them off right now.
You want me to turn my off?
Yeah. Please turn your camera off as well. Okay, now we're good to go, and hopefully we can have improved sound quality from now on. So yes, okay. You mentioned the role of perception of effort in fatigue and fatigue tolerance, or as triathletes may be familiar with, another term for perception of effort is RPE, or rate of perceived exertion. So can you dive into that a bit deeper?
Yeah, well, RPE, ratings of perceived exertion, is a measure of perception of effort. And like any psychological measure, suffers from some limitation when used as a research tool or as a monitoring tool, you know. But however, a lot of research since the 60s, when this measure was developed, is that actually humans are quite remarkable.
Sorry, we lost you there for a bit. Can you repeat that question or that sentence?
Yes, I mean, humans. A lot of studies have shown that humans, and not just athletes, I mean, any human can give a pretty accurate rating of perceived exertion as, for example, some physiological measure of effort. So there is a very high correlation between physiological measure of effort, such as heart rate or lactic acid, etc., and perception of effort. So we are pretty good at rating the amount of effort that we are exerting. Which is very, very useful. However, obviously, this measure, but so the perception of effort and ratings of perceived exertion are not exactly the same thing. And of course, you don't need to give a rating by pointing a number on a scale or by saying a number. That's the act of measuring it in order to feel effort. You feel effort even if you never saw an RPE scale, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
So you don't need to think about it, and you need to think about it when you have to give a rating. But normally, it's something that you experience without the need to think in RPE terms. And I think it's quite important because otherwise people get. And actually, although obviously we measure with the RPE scale what actual feeling that we are trying to measure with that scale. And there is a bit of a confusion also because the scale has been used sometimes in a bad way, in my opinion. So a lot of people kind of include in the ratings of perceived exertion include things like pain or general discomfort. For example, when you're very hot and sticky, or you have a pain in the bum because of saddle sores and all this kind of stuff. Obviously those are sensation that you can experience during exercise and from perception of effort. When I talk about perception of effort and ratings of perceived exertion, I mean the conscious sensation of how hard basically you are, for example, driving your legs when you're cycling or running, or how and also how heavily you are breathing. And the combination of these sensations together give what we call overall ratings of perceived exertion, which is a measure of effort.
Yes, okay, and it's good that you clarified that. Even I was did a mix up between the two, and the one is the measure of the other. So that's thanks for clarifying that. So can you now explain how the rating of or the perception of effort affects fatigue tolerance and how we perform in endurance events and training?
Yeah, I mean the key is that, and everybody that's has done any endurance activity knows it very well. The key is actually, it's not effort per se. For example, start even with a very high effort. Let's say 0 meaning no effort, 10 maximal effort. Let's say if we start a very high intensity exercise with an effort of 8, if that perception of effort stayed constant, we could, from a purely psychological point of view, we could sustain, obviously assuming that we are motivated, but we could sustain a perception of effort equivalent to 8 for forever. Is the increase in perception of effort over time. That's why defined as, if you like, as fatigue, because perception of effort per se is not a measure of fatigue. So, for example, I'm a heavy guy. I'm an ex-American football player, although I'm Italian. But and if you lift me, you will give me very high ratings of perceived exertion. But that's not because you are fatigued. It's because I'm too heavy because I eat too much. Okay. So per se, a measure of perception of effort is not a measure of fatigue. What important in terms of fatigue and endurance performance is the fact that even if you maintain speed, over time there will be a progressive increase in perception of effort. And eventually, because over time this perception of effort increases, you will reach eventually a point at which you feel that effort is very, very high, and it's equivalent to the maximal amount of effort that you are willing to exert in order to, for example, win the competition. And obviously, in people who are highly motivated, that means reaching a level of effort that is equivalent to what you perceive as maximal. So, and that's the key, is this progressive increase in perception of effort over time that is the key to determine for how long you can keep a certain pace. And basically, I mean, you can, as an athlete yourself, you can probably kind of confirm what I'm going to say. This thing, speed, perception of effort, and time and perception of effort is what you basically use to pace yourself, even if without thinking about it very much. Because obviously, the reason why you don't start an Ironman at the same speed of a sprint triathlon is because you know that if you the pace that you start a sprint triathlon, it would give you a very, you would be exhausted. You will reach a maximum perception of effort well before the end of an Ironman, and that's how you adjust your speed based on basically how you feel. And this actually is being kind of hypothesized. I'm not the first one to say these things in the scientific literature. It's been around since Morgan in the 70s. But nobody has actually really put serious investigations in this parameter. This is why it's kind of all of the rage now. But since about 15, 20 years ago, since center governor model.
Yes, and I just want to cut in here for a little bit, because you cut out a couple of times when you were mentioning key points about how the two are related. So I just want to make sure that the listeners get the sense of what we're saying here. So you were saying that if you keep your speed, your output, your performance constant, then your perception of effort will increase as you do that over a longer period of time. Was that what you were saying?
Yeah, I mean, you just go out and you keep a certain pace, right? And at the beginning, after, let's say, half an hour that you are running at that pace, your perception of effort will be higher than at the very beginning. And that's when people say, "Oh, I'm getting fatigued." Basically, what they're saying is that the same pace requires more effort than when I was rested and not fatigued at the beginning of the exercise. But and of course, how quickly it increases over time depends a lot on the intensity, on the relative intensity of that speed that you are trying to maintain.
Okay, and can you tell us about the research that you have done since that study that you mentioned already, that you proved that physiological models by themselves are not the only determinant of limits in endurance performance? And what have you done since to show how perception of effort is related to performance.
Yes. That study that we discussed is a very simple study, and it said that a lot of my colleagues in physiology, obviously, were not very happy about it because kind of put in discussion, kind of a long-held belief. Having said that, now two more groups, one from Spain and one from the United States, have kind of replicated the findings. So it's not just me. It now seems to be other people have measured the same. Actually, they measured an increase in power after a VO2 max test. You have done a VO2 max test, right? So you keep increasing the speed or the power output until you cannot, or you think you cannot keep going. But immediately after a VO2 max test, they measure maximal power output in your legs, and that was way above the power required by even the last stage of a VO2 max test. So they even kind of replicated it at a higher intensity. But I think the most important, if you like, proof that the physiological models are not enough to explain endurance performance is the fact that you can endurance performance using or decrease endurance performance purely with psychological manipulations. To this later, like things like self-talk and mental fatigue. These are factors that have no effect on your contractility of your cardiac muscle. They don't have an effect on the glycogen concentration in your leg muscles. They don't increase hemoglobin. They don't have the physiological effects that we normally associate with a change in endurance performance. However, they can have very profound effects on endurance performance. So, study that I've done also kind of demonstrate that endurance performance is certainly in part limited by psychological factors. Otherwise, whether you talk to yourself or not, you give yourself some motivational statements, or whether you're mentally fatigued or not, it shouldn't have any effect on performance according to the traditional models, but they do.
That's very interesting, and that's something that many athletes will be familiar with. They've heard people say that you should use different mantras in your races and positive self-talk. So can you, just for those that are not familiar with positive self-talk, what is it? What should a good mantra be that you use? And then how have you shown that is actually positively affecting performance?
Yeah, so I'm originally a physio. I'm not a practicing psychologist. I'm not a certified psychologist, but I can give you some tips. But I suggest people to either, find a good sports psychologist, or find some good sports psychology books or resources on the internet. There are quite a few, although unfortunately they're still not specific to endurance. We are working with some colleagues in Carla Mehan in my department and many others. And we're actually putting together a book specific on psychology of endurance performance. But that will take about at least a year or more before it comes out. We're just starting pulling it together. Anyway, so self-talk is basically talking to yourself, either out loud or within your head. And we do this all the time naturally. The first thing is obviously has to be positive. The problem is that a lot of people talk down themselves, if you like, and we call it negative self-talk, and that can actually impair performance. But within what we call positive self-talk, differentiate between different kinds of self-talk. For example, motivational or instructional. So, for example, if you think about, I don't know, keep your elbow high when you're swimming, or some sort of form-related statements that help you to focus and to remind yourself, to keep a good form, for example, during swimming. That's what we call it instructional self-talk. And to be honest, there have been some studies that included that, but there's no strong evidence that works so much. What we done in my lab, and also in other people in other labs, and has been found to be effective, is what we call motivational self-talk. So basically, you talk to yourself and give yourself positive state related to motivation and kind of self-efficacy, or things like you can do it, you feel good, keep going, this kind of very simple, short words that can be very effective. However, I'm reluctant to give you what you guys call mantras, because what we did in our study, and I think it's very, very important, and sports psychology will tell you that it's important to individualize these statements, and people should pick up the ones that they found most effective from a motivational point of view, and most important, also to practice them during training. So
yes,
it's not something that you do only during the race.
That's a good point, and that's something that we discussed at length in episode 4, I think it was, of the show, when we had Justin Ross on, who is a sports psychologist. So the listeners can go back and listen to that for more specific details on that part of psychology in endurance performance. And I want to dive into the next topic a bit, unless there's... Actually, let's... one more question about this. How do you then monitor the fatigue and your mental state, and how it can affect your performance in training and in racing?
Yes, I mean, motivational self-talk, we found it to be effective, and one of the reasons is not just because it increases motivation, but because it reduces perception of effort.
Yes, okay, that's good that you clarify that, so we got a reason, know why it works as well.
Yeah. And we think it's related to self-efficacy. So you basically convince yourself that, for example, maintaining a certain pace is easier, and as a result, you feel it is easier. Perception of effort and self-efficacy are kind of well related in a circular way, if you like. So if a task is perceived to be easy, obviously your self-efficacy to complete the task is going to be higher. But vice versa, if you're able to increase your self-efficacy, you will also reduce the perceived effort for a given task. But anyway, going back to the mental fatigue you were talking about, that's in a way kind of one of my specialties. And discussed earlier, there has been lots and lots and lots of research on muscle fatigue and endurance performance, and a variety of physiological factors that determine muscle fatigue. In very, very little interest on mental fatigue. I mean, when I did my study, and it was published in 2009, was done a year or two earlier, looking to the literature, and the only published study between inverted commas that I could find was basically just within a book chapter written by another Italian physiology professor in 1891. Wow. 1891. It's a very nice book. You can also find it on the internet as PDF translated in English. It's a beautiful book. It's almost like a humanities book more than a scientific one. It's called La Fatica, Fatigue. And it was basically referring to, so this guy was also very important in physiology because he built the very first way to measure muscular work. But with the system, again, you can find pictures on the internet. His name was Angelo Mosso. And he basically, he built the first kind of ergometer, if you like. Measuring work. But it was measuring the work produced by the middle index finger lifting some weights. You know what I mean? I mean, a very small muscle group. And basically, it was basically people were asked to lift a certain weight for as long as they can lift it. And he measured two fellow professors of physiology. One day, I think it was 24th of April, 1890. And then the day after giving lectures or doing oral examinations.
You cut out there for a bit, so we missed a bit. They had been giving lectures all day, but what did you say before that? The day after, when they did the test again, what had they been up to?
No, they did the baseline, if you like, first. On a regular day, an easy day, and then the day after they repeated this middle index finger kind of endurance test. After all morning giving lectures on oral examination, so the two professors were mentally fatigued because my fellow professor lecturers know very well that giving 4 or 6 hours of lectures after that you're really mentally drained. Can be a very fatiguing experience, but finding was that their, let's call it time to exhaustion in this middle index endurance performance test was significantly reduced the day in which they did the lectures before the test, and that's it. These were the only data in the literature that's on mental fatigue on physical performance.
Yes, but that's extremely fascinating that he did that in the late 1800s. That's very cool.
Well, it was one of the fathers of the scientific study of fatigue. But I've done a proper experiment. 20 years later or something. I use whole body exercise, cycling as a time to exhaustion test with the cycling exercise. Obviously, I did, more than 2 people, and I did proper randomization, all the kind of things that you need to do to do a proper experiment. And we basically confirm that we induce using a mentally demanding cognitive task on a computer for 90 minutes was, significantly reduced performance. A variety of physiological variable like oxygen consumption.
Can you repeat
cardiac
that?
output.
Can you repeat that again? Because there was a bit of a lag here. So from where you said that you did the study and you found that there was a significant reduction in endurance performance. And
yes, in endurance performance. And actually, the fascinating thing was that the reduction in this measure of endurance performance, which we call time to exhaust. So basically, for how long you can keep a certain pace. Basically, we just measure for how long you can do it. In time to exhaustion, which was about 15-20%, I don't remember now off the top of my head, was to the reduction that you get by pre-fatiguing the leg muscles. So in a study we did the year before, we published the year before, we induced muscle fatigue by doing 100 drop jumps before doing the cycling test.
Wow.
Yes. So it's like and this pre-fatiguing of the locomotor muscle induced a reduction in performance, as you would expect. But what was fascinating is that mental fatigue caused a very similar reduction in performance to the pre-fatiguing the leg muscle. So the fatigue is at least as important as the fatigue in your muscles in terms of limiting and determining endurance performance. But it shouldn't be surprising because both fatigue and mental fatigue, they both have the same psychological effect, obviously through different physiological mechanisms, but at psychological level, which the way I frame it, is exactly the same. It increases the perception of effort. So whether you have a tired mind or whether you have tired legs, the effect is the same. When you go on the bike or running or whatever, we also did the study we haven't published on swimming, is that the effect is the same. The same pace feels harder, and therefore you will reach the point at which you feel that you have given your maximal effort earlier than in the condition that we call it control condition, where you do the same endurance test without pre-fatigue, either muscular or mental.
That's absolutely fascinating, and it makes it very tangible that you have that comparison with the 100 drop jumps from as preconditioning or pre-fatiguing the legs. That's huge. Anybody who's been in the gym doing those sorts of plyometric exercises know that it's extremely taxing on the body. So to have that mental task fatigue you as much for a physiological effort, well, that is obviously psychological as well. It's incredible that the effect is that large.
But the thing is that there is some misunderstanding sometimes of my model. People think that what I call the psychobiological model is only the explanation that I give is only relevant to psychological manipulations, But actually, my proposal is that regardless of whether is psychological or physiological in nature, whatever affects your perception of effort and or motivation. But let's put motivation aside now, assuming that motivation is always high. Obviously, it's not always like in competition. Yes, most of the time, yes. But during training is a different story. It's difficult to maintain very high motivation every training session. But let's assume the motivation is very high, is unchanged. What determines endurance is perception of effort. And whether perception of effort is increased because of muscle fatigue, because you are taking carbohydrates, whether it is affected by mental fatigue or self-talk, doesn't matter. Logical level, whatever increases or reduces perception of effort is going to have an effect on performance. Of course, anything that increases perception of effort will reduce your performance, and anything that reduces perception of effort will increase your performance. So there's no, at that level of explanation, like I call it, there's no difference between physiology and psychology. There is a change in perception of effort. It's gonna affect your performance.
Yeah, and that's very good and a nice overview of your model, and it makes sense. It definitely does make sense because I do believe that for most of us, at a level we know that there's always a possibility to go just a little bit further. Can you go 1 meter more at this pace? Yes, sure you could, but you don't because you feel like you've given it your all. But then you look at somebody like the Brownlees in the Olympics, and they don't have any breaks basically, and they go that little bit further. So, and they just don't feel the effort as much as we do. So, yeah, I guess it makes sense when you look at it from that standpoint as well.
Yeah, so, and it gives you also a little bit of hope, because if it was all down to physiology, you may put the link to my lecture, short lecture on YouTube. Basically, in terms of trying to manipulate our physiology, although there is always some advance, but a lot has been done in the past 100 years from a scientific or a training point of view. In terms of nutritional supplementation, or even in terms of doping. Think about erythropoietin and stuff like that. So a lot has been done on trying to physiological factors that determine endurance performance. However, the fact that also psychological factor can have an effect on perception of effort, not just physiological ones, it gives you some hope that we can expose psychology a bit better to endurance and gain by doing that, but also come up with some innovative manipulations that may further improve endurance over and above, everything that you guys already do and you should keep doing, obviously training and nutrition and everything else. Saying that the mind is important is a limiting factor for endurance performance doesn't mean the one doesn't need to train or or do it. And because actually the best way to reduce perception of effort is to train. So you will reduce the perception of effort for a given speed or power output by training. That's still the best way of doing it. But on the top of that, we can now provide evidence-based, more scientifically valid strategies for, like we mentioned the self-talk, for people to improve their performance over and above what you guys already do normally.
Yes, and one thing that you have now tried, or you have shown in scientific studies that may be a great concept for athletes to do that, go ahead and do that in a very structured and validated way, is brain endurance training. And that concept, and you already kind of mentioned it in reference to another topic that we talked about in a previous question here. But can you just, training perspective, go into this a bit more, what it is really, and how it can benefit athletes trying to use it and implement it in their training?
Yes, I mean, it's still an experimental stage. We did a small study which we published some years ago now in an abstract form, and then I've done a larger study which was funded by the Ministry of Defense here in the UK, because they're very interested in kind of soldier performance. Obviously, there are a lot of parallels between soldiers and athletes, and So actually, the funding was not that; it was to study performance of soldiers. But what we found is that okay, go into reverse for a sec. So we as I said earlier, mental fatigue acutely reduces your performance.
Yes.
Anything that acutely reduces your performance, the idea is that the body, if repeated frequently enough with enough recovery in between sessions, the body, or in this case the brain, will adapt, and so that next time it's faced with the same acute, let's call it stress, is more resistant to it. So the very basic idea of brain endurance, or one of the very basic ideas of brain endurance training, is that by increasing on purpose the if you like the workload on the brain during endurance exercise, and there are a couple of ways you can do it. I'll explain to you in a minute. But the brain will become more resistant to mental fatigue because mental fatigue, obviously, in our study, we induce it with some kind of computerized task. What people don't understand is that endurance performance itself is mentally fatiguing. A lot of people think it's just when you look at somebody running or cycling, or they think, oh, it's just a kind of a physical kind of performance. But you guys know very well that it takes one of the cognitive demands of endurance performance. It's very important in terms of mental fatigue. We call it kind of there are many names in psychology. People call it inhibitory control or response inhibition or cognitive control. But the simple description is that basically any kind of short-term impulse or gain in order to achieve a long-term goal. So when you are running and you feel tired, you may feel some pain in your legs, and it's hard and everything is going wrong. For example, to keep going in face of those difficulties requires what we call inhibitory control, because you want to reach a goal that, for example, to win the competition. A very demanding cognitive ability, cognitive process. And if you have to exert this inhibitory control, obviously you also need to exert, if you want to pace yourself right and pay attention to your competitors and etc., you also need to maintain sustained attention during a competitive event, right? So all these cognitive processes are mentally fatiguing. So cycling, swimming for prolonged period of time, and even more so in a competitive situation, is very demanding on the brain from a cognitive and also obviously motivational and emotional point of view. So a triathlon is not fatiguing only the muscle, it's also fatiguing your brain. So if you become more resistant to mental fatigue, the idea is that you will become less mentally fatigued during the competition. Therefore, your perception of effort will be, therefore you can perform better, because obviously you can increase the pace because your perception of effort is lower for a given pace. You can just increase a little bit in order to maintain the pace, the perception of effort that you can maintain over the duration of the race. So, and that's the rationale, biological rationale, because the same brain, some of the brain areas that are associated with this inhibitory control, also the areas associated with perception of effort. So there is actually some neurobiological explanation underlying this brain endurance training. But you can do it. Do you want to ask me something? Sorry.
Yeah, no, it was really good to hear you talk about that rationale in detail. And I was just wondering, so you did it with a computerized cognitive task. And what would you say at the moment? First of all, you say that it's experimental. So do you still recommend that we should wait for more studies to be done before we start actually implementing it specifically in our training? But and if we still want to do it right now, what would be the best way to go about? Are there any other things you can do while training that would induce the same mental fatigue that you got through the computerized task if you don't have access to like the equipment that you have in your lab?
Yeah, well, some of the computerized tasks that I use can be found on the internet. For example, obviously, the problem that, for example, if you do, now you guys is in the winter, right? I mean, you were saying that you just did a bicycle training. Did you do it on the rollers or outside?
Yes, inside the trainer.
So, for example, if you do some indoor, with an ergometer training, you can just put a keyboard on your handlebars and do some of these tasks. The only problem that the tasks that you can find online, they are very short, so you have to keep going, repeat. We are actually working now working on this thing forever because it's not really my job to make apps, and there's problems with some of the companies we work with anyway. But hopefully, but I keep saying this every time I have an interview, we should have soon like an app that you can use on a smartphone, for example, iPad, for example, during the indoor training session, because you can use visual stimuli on the screen. So you respond to stimuli on the screen. That's the cognitive task that we use in our studies. However, obviously, you cannot do that when you are outdoor running, for example. So what we are developing is a cognitive task that overload your brain, but it's based on sounds. Instead of listening to music or mixed with the music, you can actually do a cognitive task. Earplugs attached to a smartphone, which is something that a lot of people use, especially recreational runners use. It's something that you could do this app. But this is a form of brain endurance training. I call it concurrent brain endurance training. So you do the mentally fatiguing cognitive task at the same time that you're doing the endurance training session. And this is what we tested in the Ministry of Defense funded study. So we have two groups that were doing exactly, these were not athletes, were kind of, normal, fit, young people. And we did a baseline test of VO2 max and also of endurance with the time to exhaustion test. And then both groups did exactly the same amount of endurance training. And for you triathletes, it's ridiculous, but for normal people, it's so we did 3 sessions a week, the Wednesday, Friday for 1 hour on the bike, on a cycle ergometer, to control the workload very precise, etc. Standard, normal endurance, moderate intensity exercise endurance, continuous endurance training, 3 times a week for 12 weeks. But one group did just that, standard endurance training. The other group, while they were cycling, they were doing on a computer screen with the buttons put on the handlebar, they were doing a mentally demanding cognitive task. Importantly, this cognitive task, and that's the key, because some people say, can't I just do like mathematics in my head? The answer is no, because you need cognitive tasks that have difficult, although, you
need a cognitive task that, what was that?
The cognitive task is called AX-CPT, AS Continuous Performance Test, but doesn't matter. There are a variety of tasks that you can use. The key component, though, is that you have what we call this kind of inhibitory control. In the most famous one is called the Stroop task. So basically, you see the words, red, blue, or white, of colors, the names of the colors, and sometimes, it depends how you set it up. Let's say 50% of the time, the word red is written in red. Color of the word and the meaning of the word are congruent. See?
Yep.
The problem is you have to respond to the color of the word, not the meaning of the word. The problem is that when they are congruent, it's very easy. When, for example, you write the word red in green, basically a conflict between the meaning of the word red and the color of the word that is green. And your brain has to inhibit to go with the meaning of the word in order to give the correct answer, which is green. You have to press the green button, not the red button, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
So,
yes.
you would say, what the hell does that have anything to do with endurance performance? But actually, the brain areas that are activated when you do that, when you inhibit your kind of automatic response to go with the red button and push the green one, because the green is the color of the word, the correct answer. In order to do that, you fire exactly the same brain areas that are, at least in part, associated with generation or perception of effort during physical tasks, but also that you would activate if you are in pain, for example, or fatigue, and you inhibit the urge, if you like, of your body. Your body is telling you stop, or slow down, right? But because you want to win the race, you force yourself to you inhibit this normal tendency. Most people would just give up and slow down or just stop. You guys keep going, and that control fires exactly the same brain areas that are fired by this cognitive task. But this is why mathematics is not ideal, because you don't have that component. Doing mathematics in your head is not the ideal task for brain endurance training for that reason, even if it can be difficult for some people, but it doesn't have this component of inhibitory control. So you need some specific tasks. And this one, you respond to combination of letters, but it doesn't matter. You have this inhibitory component, and you keep doing that basically for an hour, 3 times a week while you're cycling. That was the brain endurance training group. And this is what I call the concurrent brain endurance training, because you do the endurance training and the cognitive tasks at the same time.
And is there any additional benefit to doing that while you're actually the concurrent and brain endurance training, or have you found that in studies, or is it still just something that you haven't tried with doing the same sort of cognitive tasks but doing it separate from the endurance training?
Yeah, we did a small study, so the data are not as reliable as the second one I just described, but we did a small study. Hutchinson did that, which is, I call it the separate brain endurance training. So they did the mentally fatiguing task and the endurance training completely separate, right?
Right.
And we also found an improvement, but it wasn't nearly as large as the improvement that we found with the concurrent. So it seems that the concurrent is better than doing the task completely separate from the endurance training. Because the subjects were different. It's from a scientific point of view, I don't have a strong evidence, but the data so far suggests that doing it at the same time, it may be better. And actually, in that study we did at the same time was mainly a practical one, because you don't want to increase the amount of time that a soldier has to train in order to get a benefit. So we combine it, because basically you train the same amount of time, but you combine the two kinds of training to get a better response.
Well, that is very relevant for triathletes as well, because
exactly. But also there are some evidence that exercise stimulates some substances like NGF, the nerve growth factor, IGF, so like substances that kind of increase the ability of the brain to form, for example, new connection, or to the neurogenesis, we call it. The neurons, which are the cells that make up the brain, kind of branch out better, etc., etc. So there may be a synergy between, if you like, anabolic effect of exercise on the brain and the cognitive task. However, I didn't mention this study. So in terms of fitness, both groups improved the same in terms of VO2 max, which is not surprising, because from a physiological point of view, they did exactly the same amount of work. We did it on the ergometer, we controlled it very well. But when we did the time to exhaustion test, count the improvement in VO2 max, so they were exercising, everybody was exercising at the same relative intensity. They which is the standard training group, improve time to exhaustion by, I think, 50%, 45%.
50%.
45-50%, which is
45. Okay.
yeah,
Yep.
it's a time to exhaustion, right? It's not a time trial. Yeah. The group that did the brain endurance training study improved kind of 100%, so doubled.
How long were those times to exhaustion around about?
So they basically went from about 20 minutes, half an hour, to 40 to 60 minutes.
Okay, yeah.
At the
Well,
same,
they're just active people, so you can expect a bigger improvement. But it's still very, very, very interesting that the difference between the two groups were so big, so that you really found
also
a strong effect there.
VO2 max though. So they were both good. So we increased the power output at which they were doing the VO2 max, the time to exhaustion test.
Yeah, so you controlled for everything. So yeah, that's what makes it such an interesting and exciting finding, even though it needs more. It's still an experimental stage, as you say, with just the one large-ish study done so far. But it's very exciting for sure. And we've been going on for a long time, and I could go on for so much longer. As some of the listeners may know, that I'm in my day job. I'm an engineer, and I work for a company that basically works with brain stimulation devices. So this is very close to both my day job and then my alter ego as a triathlete and triathlon coach. But we need to wrap this up pretty soon. I actually have another interview tonight, but we'll move into the rapid fire question segment. And Sam, I want to challenge you to answer these within maximum 30 seconds, each of these questions. So the first one is, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to endurance sports, psychology, or triathlon?
Okay. For books, I would say How Bad Do You Want It by Max Fitzgerald, which is nice combination of kind of science and kind of stories. And as a blog, I think you mentioned before, Sweat Science by Alex Hutchinson it's Inside Runner's World website. It's a very good source of kind of digestible scientific information about endurance. So I would suggest your readers to follow him. It's it's very, very good.
Yes. And one good mantra that you would recommend? We have actually talked about this, but you can answer it again, that you'd recommend triathletes use in their positive motivational self-talk.
Yeah, you basically answered. I wouldn't give a specific mantra. As soon as they are positive, not negative, and as soon as they are motivational, as they are kind of works for you, they are relevant to you, and practice them in training. There's no magic word, it's what works for you, as soon as they are motivational and positive.
What's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
I would say basically try not to stay in my comfort zone and, for example, just read within physiology, but just look outside of my own discipline. And that's been very useful in my scientific career. It's very difficult, it's hard, but I gained a lot by, for example, neuroscience, not just exercise physiology.
Yes, all the magic happens outside the comfort zone. Do you have a productivity hack that you use to fit everything into what I'm sure is a very busy life?
Yeah, I'm not that good, I guess, as the productivity. I mean, as we know, multitasking is very bad. So what I'm trying to do now is to have the colleague kind of, time zone. Like I put away some, half a day or a day during the week where, for example, I can just write up or read without being distracted by so many other things. It's very difficult to achieve, but it's the only way to do really, meaningful, very, very deep work. So that's what I'm trying to do at the moment, actually. It's difficult, but I'm trying.
Speaking of deep work, that's a book that I really recommend reading, if you haven't already. That's the name of a book. I can't remember the author, but it's excellent.
Okay, I'll give it a go then. I'll have a look on Amazon.
And finally, what's a common but perhaps surprising trait of mentally strong endurance athletes?
Yeah, I mean, we did a study where we compare recreational cyclists with kind of really good Australian road cyclists, professionals, and we found that, not surprisingly, but it was surprising the way we measured it, that they have much higher resistance to mental fatigue, a much higher inhibitory control than the recreational ones. And this has been measured on cognitive tasks. They have nothing to do with the endurance performance. So it's the surprising thing is that this goes across different domains of life, not just endurance, but also cognitive tasks and other things that you do in your life. Is a very basic trait.
Right. Can you give an example is there an example from everyday life about when you would exhibit inhibitory control?
For example, if you think about, if you are an endurance athlete that struggles, for example, with weight, most of you guys are lean, but if middle age, maybe like more amateur, the ability to, for example, diet, not to eat for several weeks in order to make your racing weight. That's an example of like not endurance related to exert inhibitory control, because obviously there's a lot of tempting food around, and but also things like going to sleep, avoid alcohol, partying, all these kind of aspects of an elite endurance athlete. They all involve inhibitory control. It's not just the training that goes into being an elite athlete.
Yes, excellent. This has been very, very fascinating, Sam. I'm super thankful that you came on the show, and this will be very interesting for the listeners, I'm sure. Can you tell the listeners where they can find out more about you and what you guys got going on? And if there's anything you want to plug, then feel free and go ahead to do that.
Yeah. I'm actually working now more on stuff that's very relevant to kind of ultra endurance athletes rather than triathlon. Obviously, although a triathlon is an ultra endurance event, but I mean ultra endurance events where multi-day events. So where sleep deprivation is an issue, because obviously sleep deprivation is if you like, an extreme form of mental fatigue and can reduce your performance. So what's the optimal schedule for sleeping, and how to best use caffeine, etc., etc. I think that's the kind of stuff that I'm working on at the moment. And I think the best way to find out about what I'm doing is to follow me on Twitter. Gosh, I forgot the Twitter. You can find it. I think it's at Samuele UK, but I'm not sure.
Yes, we'll have it on the show notes. So
yeah, that's the social media that I use to promulgate my research, and so I think that's the best way to get in touch with me, basically.
Excellent. Thank you again. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And for the listeners, on next episode, we'll talk about strength and conditioning for triathletes with Frank Velasquez. So stay tuned for that. Until then, have a nice week. Bye.